Capital markets have developed extensively in China since the Deng era of the late 70s. This has opened the door to funding for economic growth and expansion, but it hasn't opened equally to both private and state enterprises. Recall that the state banks fund state enterprises. They give them low interest rate subsidized loans with favorable terms, whereas households and small businesses rely heavily on their own savings or retained earnings. This means that there's a disproportionate amount of capital flowing to the state companies relative to the private companies. But there is a source of funding available. It's just unofficial. And it's in a region of China known as Wenzhou. This is an area where back in the early 80s, black markets emerged for capital. People needed loans, other people had savings, and they found this arena to trade in. And the corresponding interest rate that is charged in these unofficial markets is the Wenzhou rate, which is essentially the rate that private enterprises would pay to borrow money in these unofficial markets. Because the state-owned enterprises make up such a large part of the Chinese economy, we need to consider their role in capital markets and the commensurate inefficiency that can result. To understand this, think about what would be economically efficient in capital markets. Well, that would be where you take funds at a certain interest rate and turn them into a project that yields a higher interest rate. If I own a small enterprise and I borrow money at 4% interest, but I then invest that in a project that yields 6% interest, I have a positive rate of return. That is an economically efficient project because I took money that was valued at 4% and turned it into 6%. Well, in the private sector, that's what typically happens. But remember, in China, the state sector is big, and political rather than economic criteria may be used to determine capital allocation. The state might borrow at 4% and turn that into a project that yields 2%. That's a negative rate of return, but there are political motives for doing that. Given the capital market inefficiency, in addition to the other issues such as deficient property right protection, lack of rule of law, biased court systems, etc., it makes you wonder why anyone would want to invest in China. But they do, as exemplified by the high foreign direct investment. A lot of companies would rather set up shop in China than in the US or Europe. First, it's because China has low-cost labor. This is a big one. A company that operates in China could literally cut their labor costs in half or even more. This makes them more competitive internationally, and it increases profit margins. Another factor is stable leadership. Because China operates with an autocratic government, currently Xi Jinping is the leader, we know what the leadership looks like. He's in charge and he's there for life. That creates stability, and stability has value to investors. In the US, in contrast, we don't have stable leadership. We turn over our president every 4 years, as one example. Don't confuse leadership with policies. In China, there are not stable policies because the leader has so much power that they could change policies overnight and dramatically. Whereas in the US, we do have stable policies because it's almost impossible for a president to dramatically change policies. They simply don't have that much influence, and there's the checks and balances with Congress and the Senate. Both of these have value. Investors would prefer to have stable leadership and stable policies, but you kind of pick your poison. A third factor is that China is an emerging market with high growth potential. This goes back to long-run growth theory that says that smaller economies, infant economies, I should say, will grow more rapidly than larger, mature economies. So if China is in the late 70s an infant and the US is mature, we would expect China to grow more rapidly than the US. This would cause investors to see higher rates of return in China than in the US and invest accordingly. It's important to note that these factors do change over time. China today is not in the same position it was in 1978. For example, labor has become much more expensive, and the emerging market status has diminished. The rates of return in China today are not even close to what they would have been 30, 40 years ago. Interestingly, this has caused foreign direct investment to move away from China and towards other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. A lot of capital flows through Chinese stock markets. There's two big exchanges in China. There's one in Shanghai, which is one of the largest stock markets in the world, and the other one is in Shenzhen. Both allow foreigners and Chinese nationals to invest in stock and effectively fund Chinese companies. A shares are denominated in the local currency, the renminbi, and these shares are primarily available to Chinese investors, whereas B shares are available to Chinese investors and foreign investors. These are denominated in dollars. One of the easier ways for Americans to purchase Chinese stock is through an American Depository Receipt, an ADR, which is denominated in dollars and actually traded on a US stock exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange. In China, there is no significant market for corporate control, meaning there's less accountability for companies that are mismanaged. Remember, in the US, if a company is being poorly run, then other companies or a corporate raider like a Warren Buffett might see untapped potential. They might say, well, we can take over that company and run it right and make money. So they do that. They buy up a majority of shares and they commandeer control over the company. That forces companies to operate more efficiently so they don't get scooped up and taken over. Another issue is the favored treatment that the state-owned enterprises get. There's all sorts of incentives to invest, put your money in a state-owned enterprise stock over a private enterprise stock. Again, giving an advantage to the big companies that are managed by the government. Significant political intervention is another issue. This causes uncertainty and added risk to investors. This goes back to the lack of stable policies that we talked about before. So stock markets are very robust in China, but not without risk. And for investors, it's important to balance that risk with return. Fortunately, China's high returns have allowed it to still attract a lot of capital into its stock markets. Special economic zones. These are areas with lower trade barriers and regulations. The idea of these zones was for China to carve out certain regions that would attract foreign capital. And it's worked really well. Most of these areas are located near what's called Greater China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan. You can see this in a map of China, where you have China, a very large region, geographically, but most of the financial centers hover on the east coast of China. The east coastal regions were areas of trade going back historically. So it makes sense that if a lot of trade is occurring, there's going to be a need for capital markets. And note we have Macau here, Hong Kong here, and Taiwan here. So it would make sense for China to have its capital markets in close proximity, and they do. Take a look down here. You'll notice adjacent to Hong Kong, we have Shenzhen. which is where the second largest stock market in China is. Okay, let's back up. Side note here, Macau is the gambling capital of the world, so that fits in a little bit of a different sense. If we go up the coast here a bit, you'll see Wenzhou, which is the informal market arena that emerged decades ago to allow for capital to flow to private enterprise and individuals, the Wenzhou rate. And then if you scroll up further, you'll see Shanghai here, which is the largest of the two stock markets in China. All right, so geography matters, right? And it all starts to come together when you see the location of these financial hubs. Okay, so special economic zones. Next, let's talk about Chinese labor markets. Under the old system that corresponds to the Mao era, every able-bodied person worked, even if they were redundant or unprofitable. The state-owned enterprises, which were all businesses, could afford to employ people that are unproductive because there's no accountability. They don't go out of business if they have more costs without benefits. But when the reform system came under Deng and the economy shifted from a central planning to a market-based system, private enterprise could not employ redundant and unprofitable workers because they would get the costs and not the benefits. And they would be outcompeted by other companies. That means that only profitable workers were employed, leaving a lot of workers unemployed in the reform period. Same thing happened in the Soviet Union, where unemployment rates go up, even though the economy is moving towards a more efficient allocation of labor. That creates some discontent. And one of the biggest concerns in the transition from socialism to capitalism is really the high unemployment and potential homelessness, poverty that ensues in that transition. Today, the state-owned enterprises still exhibit the redundancy and overemployment, but not the private sector. Chinese workers do not have free assembly rights. Remember, it's an authoritarian system, no democracy, so you cannot assemble and form groups to represent you, such as unions. So private unions do not exist. This is actually a violation of the WTO membership rules, which says that you have to allow unions to emerge. China does not abide by that rule. They also use prison labor, which is another violation of the World Trade Organization. So labor markets in China have become more free, allowing people to pursue their own occupations that they desire, allowing people to earn, higher levels of income and have upward mobility. But workers still do not have many of the rights that Western countries do. Workers do have access to Social Security and medical insurance. For example, state enterprises pay 20% of payroll for retirement and 8% for healthcare. So essentially 28% of a person's pay gets put into these programs so that they can retire and get healthcare. So if you made $10,000, the company you work for would put $2,800 into this fund on your behalf. The problem is coverage because it only covers state urban workers. So if you have to work for state and you have to be in the city, which is less than 1/5 of China's population. So that means that 4/5, 80% of the population is not eligible for these programs. And in addition, it's a pretty meager program. It replaces about 20% of pre-retirement income. So if you made $10,000 a year, you would end up with $2,000 a year in retirement. Now, it's important to note that we're focused here on the government provision for state workers, but the majority of people do not work for the government. They work for private enterprises. And that involves a hodgepodge of different retirement programs and medical insurance programs. You may work for a company that provides better than the state. You may work for a company that provides less than the state or nothing. Regardless, there are weaknesses for most people in China. And that has led to the cultural differences we see. They have higher savings rates, familial unity, self-reliance, and hard work. All these social institutions emerge to deal with the deficiencies in future provisions.